Chapter 097. Illusory. Standing on the roof of one of the academy buildings, the two groups stared at one another without speaking. The situation had already been tense, and Jornak's threats only made it more uneasy and unstable. Zorian suspected that if one of them made a single suspicious move, the other side would attack and the whole meeting would instantly degenerate into violence. Probably the only reason that hadn't happened thus far was that both sides realized they couldn't meaningfully hurt the other. They had picked this place for a reason. It was too exposed, too close to powerful mages standing watch, and too heavily protected by a warding scheme that neither side was keyed in on. If a battle were to start, it would be hard to deal a finishing blow and decide anything. Even if one side gained the upper hand in the fighting, there was no way for them to keep their opponents from simply running away. They would just be revealing their trump cards and making outside observers even more aware of the secret war being waged all around them. Zorian watched the stone token in Jornak's hand while considering his threats in his head. The Wraith bombs were kind of expected, though Zorian did not really think they would be using them outside of Cyoria. He thought they were intended to be used as support for the invasion itself, not as a way to blackmail them into a truce. As for the threat of an assassination campaign that could start another war, well, Zorian wasn't sure he entirely believed that. How would Jornak actually test this? Zack never mentioned any sudden wars erupting in the time loop, and he surely would have if he witnessed any. In Zorian's opinion, Jornak was just making an educated guess, based on the various information he gathered in the time loop, and it was an open question what would really happen if he were to kill a bunch of really important people in quick succession. Then again, during that fateful incident where Quatakikl tried to mutilate Zack's soul and brought Zorian into the time loop, Zack ended up in a coma for quite a few restarts. And it was very likely that Zorian spent a number of restarts in a similar state as well. Perhaps it was during some of these lost restarts that Jornak tested such large-scale schemes for viability. And then there was Oganj, the infamous dragon mage that had killed an entire army and one of the Immortal 11 sent to deal with him, the terrifying dragon that had menaced northern Altazia for centuries now. Zorian was a little mystified why Jornak was invoking his name so smugly. Sure, Oganj was an immensely powerful opponent even by dragon standards, but hadn't Zack already killed him once? He distinctly remembered Zack going through a great number of short restarts in order to... He glanced at Zack again. His friend did not seem as calm about Oganj's involvement as Zorian thought he would be. What am I missing here? Zorian asked Zack, sending him a telepathic message. Didn't you already prove you can best Oganj? I'm not even sure I could repeat that feat inside the time loop, let alone here in the outside world. Zack immediately sent back. Are you saying you winning was a fluke? Zorian asked, surprised. It wasn't a fluke, Zack responded, sounding faintly outraged in his thoughts. I beat Oganj fair and square. However, I kind of brute forced things and took advantage of the fact I could learn from our fights and Oganj couldn't. Unless I caught him off guard, unless I timed things just right, unless I knew what spells he usually uses and counters my moves with, I'm not sure I could beat him in a straight fight. Zorian did not often hear this kind of admission from Zack. If there was anything that Zack was good at, it was a straight fight. Then again, his main advantage, his massive mana reserves, was not as big of a deal against a dragon as it was against human mages. All dragons had impossibly huge mana reserves by human standards. Is Oganj more powerful than Quatakikl? Zorian asked. Not even close, Zack said immediately. He doesn't have the huge variety of spells that Quatakikl does, his body is too large to teleport around easily, and if you kill his body he will actually die. The old bag of bones is still the toughest opponent I ever faced. Still, Oganj is incredibly powerful. Even worse, he has students. Students? Zorian asked curiously. As in dragon ones? What else? Zack responded. Even though dragons are usually solitary, dragon mages had to find a way to pass on their skills to a new generation. Otherwise, their traditions would never spread and would eventually die out. For that reason, all dragon mages occasionally take a young dragon as a student to pass on their teachings. Usually a dragon mage will only have one student at any particular time, but Oganj is more powerful and confident than most dragon mages. He currently has 2 students. Crap. 3 dragon mages, he lamented. Even if the 2 students were mere beginners, this is still bad news. 3 dragons working together was already a cause for panic for most people. Having them all be dragon mages as well made a terrifying group that would give even Zack and Zorian pause. "Are you done talking to each other?" Jornak suddenly asked. "Just so you know, when I say I can get Oganj and his group to work with me, I don't just mean his 2 students. You see, Oganj has been making connections with other dragon mages and even regular dragons. You may not know this, but human-dragon relations have been steadily becoming worse lately, what with Eldamar and other northern countries constantly pushing deeper into the wilderness with their colonists. As solitary as they are, dragons are still intelligent beings and they can see where this is going. Some of them have been wondering if they should temporarily band together to halt or at least divert human advances, and Oganj is something of a logical figure to rally around in that case. If he moves against Eldamar, there could be as many as 20 or even 30 dragons following behind him." Zorian couldn't help but twitch at the explanation. His first instinct was to dismiss Jornak's claims as pure fiction, but there were precedents for large-scale dragon attacks happening. Usually when humans attacked dragon nesting grounds or killed too many dragons in too short of a time, but still. And 30 dragons? That would take an entire army to stop. Except that an army was a lot less mobile than a group of 30 dragons, which meant Oganj's group could advance practically unchallenged through Eldamar's territory, laying waste to all they encountered and simply fleeing whenever they were confronted with a force big enough to deal real damage. It would take an entire group of ultra-powerful mages to counter such a flight of dragons, and assembling such a group would take months. If Eldamar was simultaneously suffering from assassinations of its prominent leaders and the entire continent was teetering on the brink of another war, it was questionable whether it would be assembled at all. It was interesting though. Some dragons had friendly relations with humans, but Oganj wasn't one of them. Considering his antagonistic past with humanity, it couldn't have been easy to convince him to work with Jornak. Still, Zack was adamant that the stone token in Jornak's hands was Oganj's calling card and was genuine. That meant he probably did reach some kind of agreement with the old dragon mage. It was becoming apparent that while Zack and Zorian had largely focused on accumulation of personal power and skills, Jornak had spent most of his time trying to investigate the various states and organizations in their surroundings in order to figure out how to manipulate them. Probably a smart decision considering he wanted to enact some kind of grand change in the entire continent and possibly create his own version of the Icosian Empire with him on top. Personal power alone couldn't do that. Thinking on it some more, it was likely that Jornak's focus on recruiting others to help him originated from pure necessity. If he had started off as a temporary looper like Zorian suspected, it made sense that he was focused on trying to leverage people around him to accomplish his goals. He was not a master mage and he'd had a limited amount of time to work with, so slowly training to become good enough to accomplish things himself had not been a possible option. "You know, nothing you said really addresses my question from earlier," Zorian pointed out to Jornak. "Delaying the conflict until the summer festival does not benefit us in any way. You and Silver Lake will die if you can't release the primordial before the deadline, and you can only make an attempt on the day of the summer festival. So it makes sense that you want to postpone the conflict until then. However, Zack and me have every reason to push things and try to resolve things sooner. Nothing you said changes that. In the end, all you did was name a bunch of threats and try to blackmail us into agreeing to a terrible deal." "Yes, that's entirely true," Jornak said calmly, nodding slightly at him in agreement. "The truth is I don't think I can keep the conflict manageable at the rate it is going. It's only been a few days but we're already raising red flags everywhere. At this rate we're going to end up dragging the Eldamarian government into it whether we want to or not. Not even the local mage guild, subverted as it is, can fully suppress what is happening. And if that happens, then the release of the primordial becomes all but impossible to pull off." "You're losing the fight and getting desperate," Zack said. "I wouldn't phrase it that way," Jornak said carefully. "But it is definitely true that I and Silver Lake here are not in a good position. We made a deal with the primordial to release it or die and we can't weasel out of it. If we can't release Panic Seth from his prison by the end of the month, everything else will become pointless. However, should everything really fall apart that severely, why wouldn't I drag you all down along with me? If you drive me into a corner like that, I will obviously turn to destructive and extreme methods." "Zorian is right. This is just brazen blackmail," Zack said flatly, frowning at the man in front of him. "I'm just explaining my logic," Jornak said. "I think it makes perfect sense for me to escalate things if we continue down this path. In the current situation, Aldemar can do as they wish and focus on sorting out the situation in Cyoria at their leisure. Meanwhile, if I kick off another splinter war, release hundreds of wraiths in all major cities, and get a group of dragons to lay waste to the entirety of northern Aldemar, well, it just might give them more pressing matters to worry about. And a narrow chance to live is better than having no chance at all. Wouldn't you agree? Zack and Zorian said nothing to that. See, I think you're reasonable people, Jornak continued, undaunted by their silence and frosty glares. If anything, he grew more animated in his speech and mannerisms. You didn't immediately run off to inform the crown about what is happening. You spared the life of Vaers, even though he was clearly connected to me in some way. You came to this meeting to see what I have to say. Therefore, I think you're going to be reasonable about this. After all, even if you agree to this truce, you still have a high chance of stopping us in the end. Letting us delay the battle until the end of the month may be a little suboptimal for you, but it's not a catastrophe. If you push me too far, we both lose. If the sides were reversed, would you take your own deal? Svim suddenly asked, interrupting his explanation. Jornak hesitated for a moment, mouth open, before his mouth snapped shut and he shook his head. Not a chance, he admitted. Silverlake laughed at the admission, a sharp cackling laughter that somehow looked more appropriate on her old withered form than on her current young one. Then how can you call it being reasonable? Svim probed further. Because you are not me, Jornak said. I wouldn't accept it because I wouldn't care about the death and destruction so long as I win in the end. I accepted this as a price for what I want to do a long time ago. I'm guessing you are far more reluctant to make that sacrifice. He was probably right about that. If it were just Zorian and Svim making decisions, maybe they would have decided to cold-heartedly ignore the threats and continue pressuring Jornak and his group. Maybe. However, there was no way either Alanik or Zack would be fine with that. Especially Alanik, since he clearly cared a lot about Aldemar. Not just the people but the country itself as well. For a while the scene was quiet, as Zorian and the rest of his group discussed the situation in front of them via telepathy. Jornak and his group were probably discussing something through magical means too, considering their body language and brief looks, though Zorian did not really know if they were using telepathy or something else. Probably something else, as all three were under the mind-blank spell. It was a good thing they had decided not to bring Spear of Resolve with them, he mused. Her telepathic prowess would have been largely useless against the people in front of them, and her skills at other forms of magic were relatively humble. She couldn't teleport away or even just fly off into the distance. If a fight were to break out, she would have been a rock around their neck, unable to contribute to the battle, incapable of quickly retreating, yet important enough that Jornak and Quatakikal would definitely want to see her dead. No, it was best she stayed safe in the depths of her web for now. If we agree to this, how can we be sure you won't be here tomorrow to demand further concessions in exchange for not wrecking everything? Zack finally asked. As we have already established, this truce is more in our favor than yours. Why would I risk things like that? Jornak asked with a raised eyebrow. In my opinion, I'm the one who should be worried. You have every incentive to agree to the truce and then dishonor it later. How can I be sure you won't just take advantage of the truce to build up your forces and dishonor it a few days later? I can't. All I can do is immediately make good of my threats in response. Zorian clacked his tongue at the explanation. So this truce was basically toothless and could fall apart at any moment if one side pushed more than the other could tolerate. And there would definitely be plenty of pushing and testing of waters, that much was clear. If any side saw a chance to gain an advantage by dishonoring the deal, they would do so in a heartbeat. Threats, threats and more threats. Just so you know, if you come later to demand more from us, I will immediately attack you, consequences be damned, Zack told him darkly. Does that mean we have an agreement? Jornak said with a self-satisfied smirk. Haha. Of course they're going to agree, Silverlake suddenly piped in, jumping up from her conjured chair and stretching in an exaggerated manner. She ignored Jornak's annoyed look and stepped forward with a grin. They're all too touchy-feely to risk such devastation just to stop us a little earlier. But more importantly, they recently found out that Zack will have issues surviving this month. It sure would be nice if they could take a step back from all the fighting in order to figure out what to do about that. The atmosphere immediately got even more tense and gloomy. Zorian had always known that Silverlake wouldn't have informed him about Zack's contract purely on a whim, and now it seemed like one of the big reasons for it was to put pressure on them to agree to this truce. It was as Silverlake said, They needed time and resources to figure out what could be done about this, and it would be hard to focus on this if they were constantly fighting their enemies during this time, spending their time, money, and mana on getting an upper hand. How did you even find out about that? Zack asked with a frown, directing his question at Jornak instead of Silver Lake. Clearly he felt the lawyer was the source of the information. I mean, even I didn't know I made a deal with the Angels, so how? You did know, Jornak said, shaking his head. The Angels didn't tell you who they were, but you are not completely stupid. Zack scowled at him but said nothing. There are only so many powers capable of doing what they did. You eventually figured out who it could be and raided church archives to see if they had records of similar deals being made. They did. In fact, they had examples of past angelic contracts. Many examples. Even if none of them were directly applicable to your situation, they still held a lot of clues for those who knew how to read them. You brought them to me and we worked together to piece together the general nature of your contract. I don't dare claim I understand it completely, since I've never seen the actual contract and you can't directly talk about it, but I know enough. Zorian wasn't surprised at this. Back when the angel they had summoned caused the contract to appear, he immediately noticed that the contract was written in very legal terms. More importantly, they were modern, familiar legal terms, the sort you would see in any sort of legal document in Eldamar. At first glance at least, the contract looked like something you might get if you visited a mundane lawyer in Cyoria and asked them to write up a contract for a business deal or something similar. That meant the Angels had lots of experience when it came to making these contracts. Zack shouldn't be the only person working under this kind of contract. There should be others. Perhaps many others, and not all of them could have a contract backed by divine magic. No matter how secretive the Angels were, examples of past contracts would exist somewhere out there. And with examples of past contracts in hand, some creativity when answering questions, and an actual lawyer to consult with, it probably wasn't impossible to figure out what is happening and how to convey it to others without tripping the angelic restrictions. You know, Silver Lake began, Panic-Seth's escape does not necessarily have to be for real. Zorian gave her a strange look. The contract we're under says we just have to let Panic-Seth out of the seal and our job is done, she continued. If the primordial is resealed immediately afterwards, even if we are the ones who do it, the contract will not punish us. That just shows how utterly confident Panic-Seth is in being able to handle everything, including all of us combined, once it is out of the cage made by the gods, Zorian told her. Don't tell me you actually think you can seal it back in? I'm not sure you know this, but the gods placed numerous contingencies on Panic-Seth's prison, and on the prisons of all trapped primordials for that matter, Silver Lake said. The moment he gets out, Panic-Seth will get seriously weakened. Even the primordial is not sure how badly the contingencies will hurt him. If Panic-Seth was at the peak of his powers, I would obviously be a fool to try and fight him, but if he's weakened badly enough, it is entirely possible. Hell, those cultists trying to take control of Panic-Seth, maybe they're not as dumb as we thought they are. They've overestimated their mind magic capabilities, yes, but if they had a master telepath and his hundreds of Iranian friends. No, Zorian told her. It was just a thought, Silver Lake said easily, not arguing him over it. An idle thought. I don't really think us mere mortals could seriously control an entity on the level of Panic-Seth, but perhaps we might be able to muddle his thoughts and hinder him long enough to push him back into the seal. Wouldn't that be nice? Me in red robe. Sorry, Jornak. I still can't believe that little shit lied to me about something so petty, and that I fell for it. Zorian gave her an annoyed look as she started muttering to herself again, and she cackled at him in response. Some habits were hard to break, it seemed, even if she had suddenly regained her youth. Anyway, if you agree to this, then this whole conflict could be avoided. We get to weasel out of our contract and the primordial would still be sealed at the end of the month, which means that part of the angelic contract will be fulfilled at least. We no longer have any reason to fight you or support the invasion. Happy ending for everyone. I know I've been quiet throughout this entire meeting, but surely you didn't forget I'm standing right here listening to you? Quatakikal asked her, raising his eyebrow at him. This ending of yours certainly isn't happy for me. And if I'm not happy, no one is going to be happy. Silver Lake clacked her tongue before giving Jornak a look of distaste. I told you we shouldn't have invited him along, she told him loudly. What good is he here anyway? Actually, that reminds me of something I've been wondering about for a while now. Zorian spoke up, butting in on their argument. Namely, Why is Quatakikal going along with this? The ancient lich gave him a curious look. What do you mean? Shouldn't you want Jornak to make good on his threats? Zorian asked him. Why are you here helping him bring about this truce? Why not purposely sabotage the talks and let Jornak damage Eldamar as much as possible? That's what you're here for, no? Ha, Quatakikal said. No, not exactly. I'm trying to push the continent into something more favorable for Ulquin Ibasa, not cause widespread chaos and uncertainty. Oh right, I remember now. You're trying to install Fukrinia as the local hegemon, Zorian said loudly, pretending he was just loudly thinking. He made a couple of random gestures with his hands, which he hoped would look completely incomprehensible to everyone except Quatakikal. It was something he learned while traveling through Zlotic with Zack and Nialu, and should be completely opaque to anyone who has never been there. Still, weakening Eldamar and the surrounding countries can only help you in that regard. You seem to know a fair deal about me, Quatakikal noted, giving him a searching look. We must have interacted pretty heavily in the past. Interesting, considering we seem to essentially be natural enemies. Anyway, I don't think I agree with you on this. Let's just leave it at that. Besides, why are you trying to convince me that I should start another continental war right now? Shouldn't that be against your goals? I was just curious, Zorian said before falling silent. Jornak and Silverlake gave them both suspicious looks, faintly aware that something more had been said between the lines of that conversation, before shrugging it off and continuing with the negotiation. The meeting lasted for another hour, most of which was spent making vague and not so vague threats towards one another, but eventually they reached an agreement of sorts. There would be a truce. How long it would last, Zorian wasn't sure. He would be first to admit that he intended to dishonor it the moment he saw a good chance to do so. He was sure Jornak and Silverlake felt the same way. For the moment, though, open conflict between the two groups was put on hold. After everyone left, the roof of the academy building remained dark and silent for a while before two people teleported on top again. One was Zorian, and the other was Quatakikal. So, the ancient lich began. What exactly did you invite me here for, Mr. Kaczynski? I'm going to try and talk you into giving up on this invasion, Zorian told him bluntly. Quatakikal raised his eyebrow at him. Continue, he told him calmly. Correct me if I'm wrong, Zorian began, but your current thoughts are that if the primordial is released and lays waste to our surroundings, the angels are eventually going to stop it before it can do too much damage. After all, you have seen the might of the angels personally and you are certain they can do it. So unsealing Panicseth would destroy Cyoria and deal a lot of damage to Eldamar, but it would have no real effect on Ulquin Ibasa or even the Altasian continent as a whole. The ancient lich stared at him silently for a second. I'll repeat what I said earlier. You seem to know a fair deal about me. Curious. Very curious. I wonder just how much help you got out of my other self. But that's a topic for later. Yes, that is pretty much how I see the situation. Am I wrong? You are wrong, yes, Zorian said. I have summoned an angel and spoke with him. Whatever it was. He took the cube out of his pocket and showed it to the lich. He hadn't had a chance to study the cube yet and deciphered its uses, but he hoped that Quatakikal, being experienced as he was, would be able to recognize it as an angelic artifact anyway. Quatakikal leaned forward, silently studying the cube in Zorian's hands. He did not ask to hold it, not that Zorian would have given it to him, but eventually he leaned back and took a deep breath. It must have been a pretty high-ranking angel you spoke with, Quatakikal said, sounding honestly a little impressed. Then again, considering what kind of situation you are involved in, I supposed it's to be expected. The angel told me about the contingencies that Silverlake had spoken about earlier. They aren't just some simple local effect like a divine warding field or a stored spell, Zorian said, putting the cube back into his pocket. They are security measures woven into the core of the world, and triggering them could have effects that would be global in scale. I'm not sure how far-reaching the effects would be, but there is absolutely no guarantee that Ulquin Ibasa would not be affected. Quatakikal frowned at him slightly, not saying anything. Just as importantly, continued Zorian, if the primordial is released into the world, the angels will be given free rein to descend into the material world and intervene directly to stop the primordial. At that point, they also intend to get rid of all the loose ends wandering around. Like a bunch of people that escaped from the time loop into the real world, or that one annoying lich that made the whole thing possible to begin with. I see, Quetzalcoatl said calmly. You're saying the angels will go after me if I help release the primordial. Yes, Zorian confirmed. The Lich stared at him intensely as if trying to look into his soul to see if he was telling the truth. Zorian's posture remained relaxed and his eyes stared right back at the undead mage in front of him. He was too old and experienced to be unnerved by something as simple as that. I think you're exaggerating things, Quetzalcoatl finally said, looking away from him for a moment and thoughtfully tapping his finger against his leg. Yes, there is certainly a danger of that happening, but angels are laboring under many restrictions. In any case, if I were that skittish about taking chances, I would not be where I am right now. A big part of why being a lich is so great is that you can take crazy risks without dying for good. Zorian frowned. Truthfully, he did not really think he could convince Quetzalcoatl to just give up on the invasion and go home, but he didn't expect the lich to dismiss the threat of angels so readily. Then again, he was right about liches like him being uniquely suited for taking risks. They had their own personal resurrection point. It was almost like being a time looper in a way. Well, it was worth a try. Don't say I didn't warn you, Zorian said, shaking his head. He turned to leave. You intend to evacuate your loved ones to Koth at the Terramachula estate, right? Quetzalcoatl suddenly asked him. Zorian jolted into full alertness, spinning around to face the lich. He gave him a shocked, searching look. Don't look at me like that. Silver Lake knows about it, so obviously me and that Jornak fellow also know, Quetzalcoatl told him bluntly. Don't do it. Jornak has somehow managed to reverse engineer my permanent gates within the time loop, the thieving wretch. Even as we speak, he is sending a simulacrum to Koth to build a gate there. If you dump all your people in Koth, they will not be safe. You'll just place them all in one spot so Jornak can conveniently capture them all in one fell swoop. Then he'll have a whole bunch of hostages to threaten you with. Why? Began Zorian. I don't like him, Quetzalcoatl said. Besides, he's trying to become the overlord of the entire continent. While I want to say he's an arrogant idiot who bit off more than he can chew, the truth is that this time loop you all underwent is one hell of a boon. If he's right about the first emperor of Icosia using the same method for his ascent to power, then I cannot afford to dismiss his ambitions as a mere delusion. I'd prefer to have him dead by the end of all this, even if that means you emerge victorious as a consequence. At least you and Mr. Novita have no political ambitions. And if that causes your own invasion to fail? Zorian asked curiously. You agreed to this truce partially because you know you still have a good chance to win even if you take a handicap like that, the lich said. I believe the same about my chances. We'll see each other on the battlefield, Mr. Kaczynski. Before Zorian could say anything else, Quetzalcoatl was gone. Break. Not long after the end of the meeting, Zorian went to meet with Spear of Resolve. Part of that was to inform her of what had happened there. Although it was decided she would not participate in the talks, she was still a crucial part of their forces and someone who knew about the time loop. Additionally, she and her Arania normally constantly pressured the invaders and their cephalic rat allies, so it was important he told her about the truce as soon as possible. However, if anyone from their group were to see them at the moment, they would be shocked at what they were seeing. Zorian and Spear of Resolve were not meeting each other in the dark tunnels beneath Cyoria. Instead, they were walking through Cyoria's main square in plain view of everyone. Throngs of people of all ages wandered around the place, laughing and talking and arguing, but none of them paid much attention to a teenager and a huge jumping spider walking beside him. Some of them glanced curiously at Spear of Resolve. It was clear they could see her. But then they just continued on their merry way, completely unconcerned by the giant spider wandering around the town square. Some children running past them accidentally dropped a ball near her and she deftly stopped it with her long, hairy leg. Those spider limbs were more dexterous than Zorian gave them credit for, and lightly sent it back to them. They awkwardly thanked her for returning the ball to them and then ran off while loudly arguing about something completely unrelated. This is an interesting experience, Spear of Resolve commented, watching them fade into the throng of people surrounding them. She was talking vocally this time, making use of a sound spell rather than speaking to him telepathically. Anyway, back to our current topic. No, I don't think there was anything else you could have done. You could have just refused the truce, of course, but I have no doubt our enemy would have done as he promised. Personally, I am glad that crisis has been temporarily averted. Why? Zorian gave her a curious look. None of the threats would really affect you and your web. The Wraith bombs terrify me, Spear of Resolve confided. I had the misfortune to meet one of those things once. They can pass through solid stone and they only have to brush against you to do serious damage. They aren't immune to mind magic, thankfully, but they are highly resistant to it. Having hundreds or even thousands of those things prowling around through Cyoria's underworld would essentially guarantee our extinction. Ah, nodded Zorian. Yes, that makes sense. Still, while I'm glad we delayed a disaster, that's all this is. A delay. Even if the truce holds, we still must figure out a way to counter his threats before the end of the month. Spear of Resolve continued. I'm sure you realize this, but this man is guaranteed to use these things in the end, no matter what deal was struck. A massive flock of pigeons suddenly flew overhead. Some of the birds flew low, speeding right past Zorian and other nearby people, narrowly swerving left and right to avoid hitting anything. People around them stopped and pointed, animatedly discussing the disruption, but Zorian and Spear of Resolve just kept walking. Eventually, the two of them left the town square and walked into a nearby street. They entered into a nearby restaurant and decided to sit down for a while. Of course, the chairs were designed for humans and not very convenient for Spear of Resolve. Thus, they called the staff and got them to place a stack of wooden boards on top of the seat, so that the Arania could stand on them and still be high enough to interact with the table and Zorian properly. So, Zorian then began. How many Arania in your web know about the time loop anyway? Pretty much all of them, Spear of Resolve said, curiously tinkering with the plate, metal utensils and glass placed in front of her. Zorian sighed heavily. Of course. Sorry, she told him. She didn't sound very sorry in all honesty. Word spreads around fast among us, especially if it's something so strange like time travel. It was inevitable that it would become known by everyone by now. What if you asked them to subject themselves to memory modification? Zorian asked. Spear of Resolve was silent for a while. It would be difficult, she eventually said. But possible? Zorian asked hopefully. Potentially possible, she admitted reluctantly. There have been events where the entire web agreed to have memories of a certain incident erased for this or that reason. It is always a controversial decision, however. I would have to burn through a lot of social capital to make it happen. And for what? As things currently stand, our sacrifice will not save your friend. What about that unkillable lich that you never really managed to kill? What about Svim and Olenik? What about you? I don't think it's fair to ask this of us. I've talked to Svim and Olenik, Zorian said. They are not entirely opposed to losing some of their memory. I think they could be convinced to go along with it in the end. That still leaves the lich and you as the huge looming issues, the matriarch remarked. Yes, that's true, Zorian agreed. Incidentally, what about me? Do you think? No, Spear of Resolve immediately said. I've seen your thoughts. You are practically defined by this experience of being stuck in the time loop. You spend as much time inside as you did out of it. In my opinion, no one can erase your knowledge of the time loop without metaphorically taking a sledgehammer to your mind. I really wouldn't recommend it. I see, Zorian said quietly. Part of him was relieved to hear that. He really didn't like the idea of losing such a massive chunk of his memories for any reason. But how can they save Zack, then? Was Panicseth really right in saying that one of them would have to die? He was far more selfish than Zack, he realized. Zack had already decided to die if it means he has to kill Zorian in order to live. If the situation was reversed, Zorian wasn't sure he could accept his own approaching death so easily. He was quiet for a few seconds, lost in thought, before shaking his head and focusing on Spear of Resolve again. She was quietly studying him with her large, pitch-black eyes, still standing on the stack of wooden boards that the staff of the restaurant placed on her chair. The nearby waitress asked her if she wanted something to drink, undaunted by the fact she was talking to a giant spider, but the matriarch politely refused her. Anyway, Zorian suddenly said, sweeping his hand around them. What do you think about all of this? What, the city and the restaurant? Spear of Resolve asked. Zorian nodded. It's nice. Novel. Nothing jumps out at you? He asked with interest. You mean, other than the fact people around us are ridiculously accepting of me? The matriarch asked rhetorically. Well, there are a few minor details here and there. The vibrations I'm sensing through my feet do not quite match up with what I'm used to, and it's sometimes obvious that the conversations in the background are pure gibberish if you listen to them closely, but otherwise it all looks very convincing. Recreating exotic senses like your tremor sense is a pain in the ass, Zorian admitted. I did my best, but I'm not surprised I didn't quite succeed. I'm honestly shocked that you managed to make all this so convincing to my Iranian senses, the matriarch said. It's not just a matter of mind magic skill. You must have a very firm grasp of our perspective of seeing the world to succeed at this. I'm guessing you read many Iranian minds inside the time loop. I actually shape-shifted into an Irania a bunch of times, just to really see what it was like, Zorian said. Maybe I should try that and be a human for a day, Spear of Resolve mused. I'm betting it would be an unforgettable experience. Anyway, why don't we stop here for today? Fine, Zorian agreed. Truthfully, I'm starting to get a little mentally tired from maintaining this for so long. Without warning, the world around them blurred and melted like it was falling apart at the seams. In only a few moments, the two found themselves sitting on the cold, stony floor of a small cavern in Scioria's underground. The city and the people in it were gone like they never existed. Indeed, that was what happened. Everything they saw had literally happened all in their heads. It was nothing but a mental illusion that Zorian had summoned around them. It's still going to need some work if you really want to use it in the way you hope to, Spear of Resolve remarked. I know, Zorian agreed. I'm going to need your help with this. That won't be a problem, the matriarch said. Maybe I'm not powerful enough to directly confront our enemies, but this is exactly my sort of problem. I assure you I am very good at mind magic. They talked for a few more minutes before Zorian decided it was time to go home for the day. It had been a long day and he had to sleep on things before he could consider how to go forward. One moment please, the matriarch said before he could leave. I understand the logic regarding my vulnerability to enemy action and I agree it is wisest for me to stay in the safety of our settlement for now. But I am a little unsatisfied with our current state of communication. No offense, but I'm not comfortable being totally reliant on you for all contact between us. So? Zorian asked curiously. So I decided to assign you a liaison, she said. A liaison? Zorian repeated. I guess that's fine, yes. Great. I'll call her over right now. I'm sure you'll get along perfectly, Spear of Resolve said with a trace of humor in her voice. Why? Before he could say anything, a smallish Urania excitedly skittered into the room, jumped right next to him and then excitedly started circling around him, thoroughly checking him out. Hi. A cheerful, bubbly voice suddenly sounded in his mind. I'm an enthusiastic seeker of novelty, but you can just call me Novelty. Do you want to be my friend? Chapter 098. Beneath the Surface. After the two groups of time travelers agreed to the shaky truce, the daily fighting stopped and the situation in Scioria stabilized. Zack and Zorian no longer sent their simulacrums to raid invader bases and assassinate their leaders, and the invaders seemed to have no interest in testing their luck with them. Zorian had been worried that their enemies would try to strike at them indirectly, perhaps by sending the law enforcement after them or by attacking targets technically unrelated to them, but fortunately they did no such thing. Not that the two groups were entirely ignoring each other just because they weren't fighting, of course. Zack and Zorian were constantly monitoring invader movements, trying to figure out what they were doing and what their secrets were. Where they had placed all those wraith bombs Red Robe was threatening them with, for instance. Red Robe and his allies were similarly spying on them in return. Although both groups were clearly aware of each other's surveillance, there was an unspoken agreement that this was perfectly acceptable and the truce continued. Even though this was just the calm before the storm, Zorian found himself kind of enjoying it. Too many things had happened recently, barely days apart from each other, and he had never really had time to sit down and process it all properly. They'd failed to get their group physically out of the time loop, and he ended up killing his old self after entering the real world. Zack had almost died at the start of the month, and he was certain to die at the end of it if they couldn't find a solution to the angelic contract he was working under. He doubted he would figure out something insightful about that just because he spent a few days mulling things over, but it would make him feel a little better at least. Of course he couldn't really justify wasting time right now, truce or no truce. Things still needed to be done, preparations made. Thus he decided to simply spend more time in his workshop, building up his arsenal of bombs, golems and magical devices. Something that was both useful and relaxing. He had actually wanted to set aside more time for magical artifice for a while now, but the frantic pace of their activities in these past few days made that all but impossible. Just building enough simulacrum bodies and equipping them for the daily skirmishes was challenging enough. In any case, Zorian was currently sitting in his workshop, a spacious room in the Novita mansion that Zack had generously donated for his purposes, and staring at a shiny metal plate in his hands, considering things. The large wooden table in front of him was an absolute mess of tools, half-processed materials, technical reference books, and hastily drawn blueprints that probably only made sense to him and no one else. The rest of the room was not much better. Tall, dangerous-looking golems stood lined up next to one of the walls, some of them with gaping holes in their chests, still missing critical components before they could be completed. A stack of small metal cylinders densely covered in glowing lines and magical glyphs lay seemingly forgotten in one of the corners. Zorian glanced at the half-finished construction on the table in front of him before returning his attention to the metal plates in his hand. The device he was building was still barely formed, but a perceptive onlooker would be able to puzzle out that it was a fairly large and very complicated cube. The center of it consisted of several rare and expensive crystals, which were then surrounded by a plethora of gears and interlocking pieces of metal, wood, and stone. Most of it was already done, just waiting for him to put it all together and cast the necessary spells, but he still had to make the outer chassis of the cube. "What are you making?" A cheery, excitable voice suddenly sounded in his mind. Zorian glanced at Novelty, who was currently wandering around the room and inspecting everything within her reach, caressing the items with her hairy spider legs and occasionally taking a nibble when she thought he wasn't looking. Most of his allies had no real interest in his workshop and what he did there, as they had no interest or deep understanding of magical artifice, but just about everything human-related was new and exciting for Novelty, so she insisted on coming along. He suspected she would get bored of it all very soon, but for now she was surprisingly well behaved. It was amusing, he thought to himself. Once upon a time her presence here would have driven him up the wall and he would have done all he could to get rid of her. Now he found her antics to be kind of nostalgic. She reminded him of an older, simpler time. A time when Novelty had been entirely qualified to teach him mind magic and the Arania had been his only friends. Even though Spear of Resolve had intended to betray him in the end, something he had never actually revealed to the Arania here in the real world, he still felt gratitude towards her and her web. He sometimes wondered what his life would have been like if they had somehow survived that fateful restart. Would the final outcome have been better with them around, or was their doom a necessary price for him to develop into what he was today? After all, without that reckless ploy he and Spear of Resolve concocted, Red Robe might have decided to stick around in the time loop for a long time. Zorian could easily imagine a situation where he never contacted Zack at all, constantly moving in the shadows in fear of attracting Red Robe's attention. The Arania his only ally? "Hey, why aren't you answering me?" Novelty protested. "What? Right, his project. It's secret," he told her, shaking his head. "Secret project," she said, tapping her legs on the floor excitedly. Rather than backing off, she seemed only more fascinated by the secrecy. "Is it a weapon? Ooh, maybe it's a collapsible golem that transforms into a giant spider when a command word is spoken." "Why would I make a golem in the form of a giant spider of all things?" he asked her, raising an eyebrow at her. "Well, everything is better with spiders," she told him matter-of-factly. "Plus, I heard you humans found us cute." Zorian gave her an incredulous look. What? She demanded, shuffling from side to side in agitation. "I think one of your friends played a prank on you or something," Zorian said diplomatically. "No way," she protested. "I have it on good authority that... you humans like small, furry animals, right? I saw your little sister playing with that black cat yesterday and some people are taking care of dogs and stuff. I'm afraid humans don't really place you in the same category as cats and dogs," Zorian told her. "In fact, a sizable number of humans think spiders are pretty horrifying." "Even giant spiders?" Novelty asked, visibly incredulous. "Especially giant spiders," Zorian said, laughing. "How mean?" Novelty whined, her entire body vibrating in a clear show of annoyance. Idly, Zorian wondered if painting Novelty pink and wrapping her in ribbons and glitter would make her cute enough for people to coo over. He could probably talk Novelty into going along with it. Well, something to think about if they managed to survive the month. Fortunately, Novelty got over the incident very quickly and continued her exploration of Zorian's workshop instead of brooding over the whole event. Zorian left her to her exploration. He closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and when he opened his eyes again, the metal plate in front of him was densely covered in spell formula markings. They weren't real, of course. The whole thing was just a mental illusion, a visualization of what the end result would look like based on his plans. Spotting a few possible flaws and failure points, he quickly went through a lengthy series of complicated calculations inside his head, almost instantly calculating problems that would have taken another spell formula crafter an entire afternoon of diligent calculation using pen and paper. The visualization of the end result blurred for a moment and then shifted into a different configuration that took these new calculations into account. The process repeated itself several times, gradually refining the design. Most other artificers would have to spend a lot of time and mana making test plates and waste hours upon hours every time something had to be recalculated or adjusted. But Zorian's mental enhancements allowed him to sidestep most of that process. Of course, all this work wouldn't even have to be done if it weren't for the fact that he had lost most of his spell formula blueprints while crossing over into the real world. So much work lost. Thankfully, spell formulas were one of the fields he was most confident in. He suddenly realized Novelty was poking a small metal sphere he left on a nearby chair. He pointed his hand towards her, causing invisible waves of telekinetic force to seize her entire body, and then gently but firmly dragged her away from the offending object. "Don't touch that," he told her verbally. "It's dangerous." She gave him an indecipherable look, staring at him quietly for a few seconds. "What?" he asked her. "You're pretty scary," she told him. "I didn't even see you cast anything. You just casually pointed at me and I suddenly couldn't move. And then you just dragged me off like it's nothing. I thought mages like you needed to mumble and wave when they do their weird human magic." "They do. I'm just very, very good at this," he told her. Though this did remind him that he needed to curb these kinds of moments as much as possible, since this kind of casual use of unstructured magic was not something a teenage mage like him should possess. Holding back for years and years was going to be hard. "How did you even know what I was doing?" she continued. "Your back was turned. I'm sure of it. This whole room is crisscrossed with a mesh of hair-thin mana threads centered on me," Zorian told her. "Whenever you pass through them, I can sense it." "Like an invisible web?" she asked. "Yes, exactly," he agreed. It was a detection trick he had learned at some point in the time loop, inspired by Taven's old trick of flooding her surroundings with her mana to detect hidden attacks and enemies. He didn't have the mana reserves to copy her trick exactly, but he didn't really have to. Shaping the mana into a mass of threads was much cheaper than simply flooding every nook and cranny with his mana, yet just as effective for his purposes. The only downside was that this kind of detection web required insanely good shaping skills to execute, but that was not really something Zorian had trouble with. "Scary," she repeated unhappily. She glanced at the metal sphere she had been poking before he stopped her, and then gave him a speculative look. "So what's that thing anyway?" she said, pointing at the small sphere with one of her legs. "You didn't complain when I was looking at the other things in the room, but you immediately reacted now? What is it?" "It's a hollow metal sphere holding a pocket dimension inside," he told her. "It's supposed to suck in and contain a creature inside. Like a portable prison for powerful monsters." I don't understand," she complained. "That's meant to capture people? But it's so small. I'd never fit inside." "Oh, right. Not everyone was familiar with the concept of expanded spaces and pocket dimensions and whatnot. It's bigger on the inside than on the outside. There is an entire room inside that little metal ball. You'd fit in just fine," he explained. Novelty was quiet for a second, trying to process this. "Oh, how weird," she eventually said. "You shouldn't leave it lying around like that, then. What if someone stumbles upon it when you're not around and gets sucked in? They could starve to death before you remember to check inside." "Give me some credit. I did put some safeguards on it. It's just that it's meant specifically for capturing giant spiders, so I'm not sure if the safeguards would work properly for an Arania like you. I kind of forgot I left it lying around when I let you come today," Zorian explained. "Oh. Wait, why are you making tools for capturing giant spiders?" Novelty asked, suddenly sounding concerned. "It's a secret," Zorian said. "It has nothing to do with Arania, though, so you can rest easy. Plus, if he wanted to deal with the Arania, he wouldn't need to resort to such complicated and expensive methods." But he didn't really say that out loud. Novelty already thought he was scarily powerful after all, no need to feed her paranoia further. I kinda want to get inside now to see what it's like. Novelty eventually admitted, staring intently at the sphere. Zorian snorted at the admission. And here he thought he was scaring the poor thing. Nosy little spider couldn't resist sticking her legs and fangs absolutely everywhere. It's meant to be a prison, so it's pretty bare, Zorian told her. Wait a few days and I'll show you something similar on a far larger, more interesting scale. There is an entire palace in there. And Princess. I guess I can introduce you to her at that time. Princess? You know royalty. Novelty said, sounding very fascinated. Princess isn't really an officially recognized ruler of any place, but she's very majestic. Very memorable. I'm sure you'll be suitably impressed after seeing her, Zorian said, smiling evilly inside. Huh. You know, you're pretty nice to me, Novelty remarked. Yes, I'm a pretty great guy, aren't I? Zorian indulgently agreed. Did we know each other? Before, I mean. In the future? This is so confusing. You know what I mean. Novelty fumbled, waving her front legs in front of her frustratingly. Zorian tapped his finger on the table thoughtfully. He never actually told the Arania the fine details about what happened in the time loop, and definitely didn't mention Novelty as she wasn't terribly relevant in the grand scheme of things. What gave you that idea? He asked her. It just seems like you know me a little too well, she said. It's true, isn't it? We totally knew each other in the future you came from, didn't we? You taught me mind magic a few times, Zorian admitted. I was your teacher. Novelty said incredulously. If she was human, she would have probably gasped. But that means, I wasn't just your friend, I was your senior. You should be paying your respects to me. Keep dreaming, Zorian said. It was just a couple of basic lessons and you're younger than I am. The matriarch said you don't even qualify as a real adult in human terms, whereas I already went through the maturation ceremony. So there, Novelty insisted stubbornly. She almost immediately drooped down in an exaggerated gesture of defeat, though, if I were honest, I kind of want you to be my teacher instead, she admitted. I kind of want to try learning human magic and you're the only human mage I know, so you'd be willing to help your future teacher out, wouldn't you? Sure, Zorian shrugged. I already have a huge list of people I need to help out once this is all settled. What's one more person on the list? You're going to have to wait for this month to end, though. Yes, she cheered. I'll wait. It's totally not a problem. Patience is my best feature. It took an inhuman amount of self-control for Zorian not to roll his eyes at her. What? She demanded. Liar, he told her flatly. How can you talk like that to your teacher? She complained. Kids these days no respect. Zorian blocked her out and turned back to the metal plate on the table in front of him. In a small but familiar tavern in Scioria, Simulacrum number 3 sat alone in a corner, curiously studying his surroundings. The insides of the tavern were dark, the air stale, but the place was still familiar to the Simulacrum even after all these years. This was the tavern where he used to talk with Hazlush Etc., the detective who taught him divination way back when he had still been a novice mage. Now he would be meeting his old divination teacher again, this time in the real world. He was disguised for the occasion. At the moment, the Simulacrum looked like an older middle-aged man, with graying hair and a bushy, prominent mustache. A formal brown suit, a weathered wooden cane and a roll of yesterday's newspapers completed a picture of a regular, nondescript man that he hoped wouldn't attract too much attention. However, based on the frequent glances he was getting from other people, he was pretty sure he failed at looking like he belonged here. It was likely that regular visitors to this tavern already knew each other and that a newcomer like him was automatically noteworthy, or maybe he just wasn't as good at pretending as he thought he was. In any case, it didn't matter much, since he intended to discard this identity entirely after today's talk. Eventually, a familiar man approached his table. Middle-aged, dressed in a cheap, rumpled suit and kind of unkempt, Hazlush looked just like he remembered him. He scanned the tavern quickly, his eyes soon falling on the disguised Simulacrum. The Simulacrum met his gaze and they stared at each other silently for a second. Hazlush had a sleepy, lazy look on his face the whole time as he studied him, but the Simulacrum could see a trace of wariness bleed into his posture. The information provided by his empathy and soul perception reinforced this. Eventually, the detective averted his eyes, rubbed his nose for a second, and then casually ambled over to the Simulacrum's table. Hi there. Do you mind if I sit here? Hazlush asked in a lazy voice. Not at all. After all, I did ask to meet you here, the simulacrum said. Oh, so you were the one that asked to see me, Haslush said, nodding to himself. He plopped heavily into the chair in front of him, ignoring the ominous creaking of the wood beneath him, and ordered himself a drink. Why all this cloak and dagger stuff, if I may ask? You didn't even give me your name in that letter you sent me. With good reason, the simulacrum said. We'd both be in danger if you knew who I am. But I already know your face now, so, Haslush began before suddenly frowning. He narrowed his eyes at the simulacrum, his irises glittering with a subtle divination spell. This isn't your real appearance, is it? No, the simulacrum admitted, shaking his head. For reasons of convenience, you can call me Khazur, though that isn't my real name either. I'm just a throwaway simulacrum. After this talk, I will vanish into ectoplasmic smoke and will hopefully never speak again. A simulacrum? Haslush repeated, visibly taken aback. Zorian understood the reaction. Simulacrums were high-level magic, not something that one regularly encountered. Rather than saying anything, the simulacrum extended his arm between them and willed it to unravel for a second. It quickly grew blurry and dissolved into a mass of glowing blue smoke, before suddenly reforming itself back into his arm. For this particular meeting, he didn't inhabit the usual golem body that most of Zorian's simulacrums were equipped with these days. The fewer traces he left here today, the better. He was pretty sure he had covered his tracks well enough to stop Red Robe from knowing about this meeting, but it was still best to minimize risks. Well, I'll be damned. That's not a piece of magic you see every day, that's for sure, Haslush said, recovering his calm, lazy facade. Are you sure you got the right person for this, though? This sounds almost like a job for spies and crown agents, not little old me. I'm just your average detective, Mr. Khazur. For reasons that will soon become obvious, I can't contact anyone particularly high-ranked, or things will get really bad, the simulacrum said. He took a large leather paper holder out of his jacket pocket, deliberately making the entire process visible to the man in front of him. Haslush's eyes widened imperceptibly when the simulacrum retrieved a large object from a jacket pocket it couldn't possibly fit into. It was just a temporary pocket dimension, not even a permanent expanded space, but most people would have still never encountered that sort of thing in their entire life. More than even the simulacrum, pocket dimension creation was a rare form of magic. Please take a look at this, the simulacrum told the man, handing him a stack of pictures and documents before leaning back in his chair and patiently waiting. Haslush cautiously leafed through the papers, periodically frowning and tapping his fingers on the table. His expression worsened as time went by, and at some point he ordered some really strong alcohol to get through the rest, but eventually he skimmed through the whole stack. There wasn't enough time for him to comb through the whole thing, but even a casual glance through the documents Zorian gathered painted a grim picture. This is insane, Haslush eventually said, downing an entire glass of hard alcohol and slamming it on the table in front of him. Some of the nearby tavern patrons glanced at them curiously for a moment. A full-scale invasion of the city with the local mage guild in on the whole thing? How can something like this be real? A conspiracy this grand and far-reaching should be impossible to pull off. The invaders are using permanent gates, a concept that has not been known to exist until now. On top of that, the local authorities have been hopelessly infiltrated and are working with the invaders to cover up the whole thing. It's very real, the simulacrum said. You're one of them, aren't you? Haslush suddenly said. A defector. That's the only way you could possibly know all this and have this much evidence. I'm not one of them, the simulacrum insisted, but they do have a certain amount of influence over me, or else I wouldn't be moving in the shadows like this. If I go public with this, the results will be disastrous. Really? Haslush asked, raising his eyebrow at him. A mage of your caliber. I didn't say I would die. Of course I can always run away and hide. I said the consequences would be disastrous, the simulacrum clarified. More disastrous than the city being invaded by monsters, demons and the undead? Haslush asked dubiously. Yes, the simulacrum said. Haslush waited for a second, but the simulacrum didn't intend to clarify. What he was telling the detective was unbelievable enough without getting into the whole Wraith bomb situation or the possibility of an army of dragons laying waste to northern Eldamar. Wouldn't the same be true if I were to make this public? Haslush asked. Yes, the simulacrum admitted. To be honest, the enemy would instantly realize where you got your information from, so you trying to alert people to this would be no different than me doing it myself. Well, other than the fact you'd be much easier to silence than me. Lovely, Haslush said calmly. So you don't actually want me to make these documents known to anyone? I obviously can't stop you from doing what you feel is right, the simulacrum said. But I wouldn't recommend it, no. What do you expect me to do with this, then? Haslush asked, waving the leather paper holder in front of him. He looked genuinely curious rather than angry. The simulacrum was actually rather impressed with how Haslush was behaving. Most people were either stubbornly disbelieving or had trouble thinking straight when something like this was dumped into their lap. In fact, Haslush wasn't the first person they were contacting about this, and he wouldn't be the last, but he was the one who had had the best reaction thus far. This didn't mean he would end up being useful in the end, of course, but it was encouraging. I don't know, the simulacrum said. Although it may seem like I'm holding all the cards here, I'm actually not sure what should be done here. I'm not a professional spy or master manipulator. I'm hoping that you will know what to do with this better than I do. Haslush stared at him quietly for a second before leafing through the pages a few more times. It was just an idle gesture. The simulacrum could see he wasn't really reading things, just idly flipping through the documents as he mulled things over. He eventually snapped the paper holder shut and pushed it aside before massaging his temples for a bit. This is insane, he said. Yes, you already said that, the simulacrum noted. Well, I feel like repeating myself, Haslush told him, giving him a weak glare. I suppose this does help explain all the weird attacks and sudden deaths my department has been flooded with lately. Who else did you tell about this? What makes you think I told others? The simulacrum asked, surprised. Who? Haslush insisted, not offering any explanations. The simulacrum eventually relented and gave him some names. Kylie and the other priests in the city, which were slowly being informed about the invasion. Some of the shifters living in the city whose children were going to be used in the ritual. A few other policemen and detectives Zack and Zorian had identified as reliable while inside the time loop. And so on. That's more people than I thought, Haslush noted. Aren't you afraid someone will talk? It's always a possibility, but I feel I judged people correctly, the simulacrum said. I'm a mind reader after all. Haslush immediately graced him with a string of colorful curses before casting mental defense spells on himself. Of course you're a mind mage too, the detective grumbled. Anyway, since you so graciously left it up to me to decide how to handle this, I will visit these people and see if we can figure something out. But if we decide to go higher with this information, then everything goes to hell probably, the simulacrum said. Though, maybe that would be for the best. I don't think there is a perfect answer to be had here. Maybe triggering everything sooner rather than later is actually the right move, I don't know. Whatever you decide, I'll support you as much as I can, but I'm not all-powerful. Don't be surprised if you end up dead after talking to the wrong person. I'll keep that in mind, Haslush said thoughtfully. I'm still not tired of living, I can assure you that much. Plus, I know better than anyone how disgustingly underhanded the Mage Guild can be about protecting people who really don't deserve state protection just because they are useful in some way. But let's not talk about that right now. Do you have anything else for me? Yes, the simulacrum said, retrieving a paper envelope sealed with ornate red wax. Here, have this. What is it? Haslush asked, flipping the envelope curiously in his hands. Don't open this until the end of the month, the simulacrum warned him. Otherwise, I will assume the letter has been compromised and abandon that particular place. That said, there is a key to a post office box inside. It's empty right now, but if the worst happens, there will be a package inside at the end of the month, explaining everything and containing some information to be distributed to various people. Insurance in case you die, eh? Haslush guessed. He casually stuffed the envelope in his pocket, carelessly crumpling it in the process. All right. Do you think? But the simulacrum was already unraveling, quickly becoming intangible ectoplasmic smoke. Before he completely dissolved, he thought he heard Haslush say something about rudeness. In Amaya's kitchen, there was a large and curious gathering. Zorian, Amaya, Kiriel, Kale, Kana, Ray, Nachka, Taven and Svim were all present. They weren't doing anything terribly important. The older people present were playing a game of cards and having scattered conversations, while the three little girls ran around playing with dolls. In the beginning they also participated in the card game, but they were not very good at it, so they eventually wandered off to do their thing. These sorts of meetings had happened a few times already, but they'd never had so many people before. In addition, Svim's presence was an unusual event, to say the least. Zorian thoughtfully fingered one of the cards in his hand, purposely ignoring Taven, who was sitting beside him and craning her neck in an attempt to stealthily peek at his hand. Times like this were a bit of a guilty pleasure for him, since they were entirely unproductive and he realistically shouldn't waste time on them. The reasonable response to Amaya's request to join them in their game would be to say he's busy and go back to analyzing Zach's contract again. But he was only human. Sometimes he just wanted to play cards and relax, even when the fate of the whole city was at stake. Svim was present here for a reason, though. With the discovery of Zach's contract and the fact Red Robe was sending a simulacrum to Koth to take his friends hostage, he was presented again with the question of what to do about his friends and family in the upcoming invasion. He clearly couldn't leave them to wander the city on invasion day, ignorant of the threat. However, he also couldn't just tell them about the time loop and dump them all at the Terramachula estate in Koth. In the end, it was decided that Zach and Zorian shouldn't be doing the evacuation of all these people in the first place. Some people, Taven for example, reacted very poorly to Zach and Zorian revealing crazy powerful abilities that they shouldn't have, and others might refuse to cooperate with a bunch of teenagers trying to drag them off to a completely unknown place all of a sudden. It was better to have an adult in a position of authority to contact the people. Someone in on the whole story, capable of advanced dimensionalism and respectable looking. That made Svim the prime candidate, especially since he claimed he could talk Ilsa into accompanying him and lending additional weight to his words. Ilsa was Amaya's best friend, so she would probably trust her if she said Amaya had accompanied them and hid for a few days. But it was still best if Svim wasn't a total stranger to the people he intended to contact, so it was agreed that he would visit Amaya's place one day. Officially, the visit was because he had to discuss something with Zorian since he was his mentor and all, but the real reason was so that he could introduce himself to everyone. That way, when he and Amaya came knocking to people and told them that they had to evacuate out of the city for a few days because an attack was imminent, they would hopefully be more open to the idea. As for Zorian, it was his job to arrange things so that most people were actually present when Svim visited. He thought he had done a decent job there, to be honest. Mr. Chow sure is diligent in his work, Ray remarked, throwing a card at the center of the table. You don't often see teachers making a personal visit to their student's home. I only ever saw it once, and that was because the student in question had vandalized another student's belongings, not because of anything good. Then again, I did hear that Sioria's Royal Academy of Magical Arts is on a different level than most places. I usually don't make this kind of personal visit, of course, Svim said, casually throwing a card of his own on top of hers. Zorian thought the man would be awkward or annoyed when presented with this kind of social gathering over a card game, but Svim showed no discomfort with the situation whatsoever. He wasn't exactly relaxed, but he gave off the same sort of severe, dignified atmosphere he always did. Sadly, most students today are very lazy and lack proper dedication to truly master their chosen fields. They want shortcuts and instant results, and the modern academy curriculum encourages that sort of attitude. It's the weeping, isn't it? Kale said softly. Indeed, Svim nodded solemnly. With the death of so many mages, the academy received a directive from on high to lower its standards. In more ways than one. On one hand, this meant children from wealthy, but not traditionally magical families could attend our institution far more easily than in the past, and I have no issue with that. Unfortunately, it also meant that some of the more boring and unpleasant but necessary lessons were removed in favor of practical education and other nonsensical words. As if foundation building is not practical. The conversation continued for a while in this vein, with people chipping in with their thoughts from time to time. Zorian noticed Taven staring at him at one time, but she averted her gaze when he glanced at her. She had probably started to notice that there was something weird going on with him. Well, other than him being a telepath and hanging out with sapient underground spiders. Thankfully, she was still wary of confronting him about it, so he didn't have to figure out how to explain anything for now. She was one of the people who reacted very badly to him being suddenly absurdly powerful and competent, so delaying that confrontation for as long as possible was for the best. He was still debating whether it would be better to have her join the fighting on Invasion Day or to simply hide her along with all the rest. On one hand, having her join the chaotic final fight would be extremely dangerous and there was a high chance she could die. He would be devastated if that happened. On the other hand, she was a warrior mage looking for a chance to get actual experience and make a name for herself, and he was pretty sure she would choose to stay and fight if she had a choice. Did he have the right to take that choice away from her just because he would hate to see her die or get seriously hurt? He remembered his younger self and how much he hated his parents' attempts to dictate his life for him. Taven's parents were already trying to keep her safe by steering her away from dangerous professions, and she resented them for it. If he made this choice for her, how was he any different from his mother? He would be worse probably, because at least his mother had never used advanced magic to compel him to obey. He put that decision aside for now. He could tackle that later. He suddenly realized that Kiriel had brought her new toy to show off for her friends and that it was attracting attention from the adults as well. It was a small golem Zorian had made for her. Kiriel had already painted a face on it and added hair and a dress and other little touches, so by now it looked almost like an animate doll rather than a golem. "I hope you realize this is a very eye-catching toy, Mr. Kaczynski," a voice said in his head. Zorian was startled to realize it was Svim, contacting him telepathically. Svim wasn't psychic and Zorian hadn't seen him casting any spells. Then again, it was Svim, and as he liked to say, there was a shaping exercise for everything. Laymen may ignore that golem as a curiosity, but any decent mage will know how difficult it is to produce such a thing. "I know, but that golem isn't just a toy," Zorian sent back. "Beneath its harmless facade, that thing is packed full of weapons and defensive wards. It is a veritable tiny murder machine. This way I get to give Kiriel a powerful bodyguard without being too obvious about it." "Ah," Svim responded, surprised. "I am admittedly not an artificer, but your ability in that field never ceases to amaze me. I suppose I could understand why you fear the government as much as you do. Your ability to make devices alone would make the authorities do everything in their power to gain control over you." "Yeah," Zorian agreed uneasily. He knew that his abilities would get out at some point, but that would hopefully be years in the future. By that point he should have cemented his position a bit and would be able to resist being pressured against his will. "I think your sister's friends are going to be very jealous of her, though," Svim noticed, observing their reactions. "I'm actually hoping they will ask for a doll of their own," Zorian admitted. "That way I get to put another 2 bodyguards among people close to me." Svim had nothing to say to that. Eventually the game ended and people decided it was time to disperse. Zorian was about halfway back to his room when he suddenly felt a stream of knowledge flood into his mind. It was from the simulacrum he had left studying Zack's contract. The document was hard to understand. The language used was very complex and weirdly structured, and there was a lot of text to read through. However, Zorian was pretty sure he understood the basic points by now. 2 points stuck out to him. One was that the release of the primordial was tied to the activation of the divine safeguards on its prison. If the safeguards activated before the month was done, regardless of the reason why, Zack was considered to have failed in his mission. Zack's perception did not matter here. The contract could detect the activation of the safeguards innately, and was apparently tied to them on some intangible level. Zorian could not detect this connection on Zack, but the contract claimed it existed, so it probably did. Divine magic was headache-inducing bullshit anyway. Zorian suspected that this part of the contract was the core of it. It was clearly the most important part of it. It was defined near the very beginning of the document and had the most unambiguous terms. The second thing was the definition of time loop knowledge. Zorian had been hoping that enforcement of this clause depended purely on Zack's perception of what counted and what didn't, which would make it really easy to manipulate it through warping Zack's perceptions, but it wasn't quite that simple. The contract defined exactly what counted as informing people about the existence of the time loop. Telling people he was a time traveler, describing his experiences in such a way as to make it clear he had gone through the same month multiple times, describing future events in a way that made it clear he had already experienced them, all ran afoul of the terms of the contract. In fact, that part of the contract went into considerable detail to close any sort of loophole that would allow Zack to tell people about his experiences in the time loop. Even telling people he came from another world was not okay. It was obvious for a while now that the angels really didn't want anyone to know about the time loop, but reading the contract really drove the point home for Zorian, which caused an ominous feeling to arise in his heart. After all, the contract had an expiration date. At the end of the month it would dissolve and Zack would no longer be bound by it. That meant that after the month went by, Zack would be free to make his experiences as public as he wanted to make them. Were the angels really fine with that? The contract strongly suggested they weren't, but there was really nothing stopping Zack from doing just that. Maybe not immediately after the month ended, but as years and decades went by, a person might get tempted to write a book or something before he died. It would probably be very convenient for the angels if Zack and Zorian stopped Panic Setha's release, but perished some time afterwards. His paranoia aside, the good news was that the enforcement of that particular clause of the contract depended entirely on Zack's own perception, just like Zorian suspected. Zack was the one who determined whether a violation of the contract had occurred or not. If someone knew about the time loop but Zack never found out about it, the contract would never know either. It pulled information straight from Zack's senses, thoughts, and memories. Zorian knew a couple of mental enhancements that might be used to manipulate that, but Zack's restrictions when it came to mind magic prevented him from teaching them to his fellow time traveler. Not that they had time for that, but still. Zorian had a feeling the mind magic restrictions weren't just due to ethical concerns. Curiously, there was nothing in the contract stopping Zack from doing what Zorian planned to do and just giving people research notes that they had written themselves. Even though such information was clearly made through time travel, and some of the more perceptive and open-minded recipients would probably realize they come from some future version of themselves, it wasn't actually against the rules. At least not to Zorian's amateur eyes. So long as the notes never said where they came from and only incidentally hinted at their origin, they were fine from the contract perspective. This was good, because Zorian had an important task to accomplish in the coming days. He had to talk to his older brother Daimen. He obviously wasn't going to be sending his friends and family to the Terramachula estate now, since he knew that Red Robe was setting up an ambush party there to take advantage of that. Nonetheless, the fact remained that his older brother and the Terramachula were now in danger because of him. If only for that reason he had to talk to them. And he doubted he could convince Daimen to accept him as the legitimate Zorian without utilizing the notes his older brother had written for himself inside the time loop. Even with them, he was definitely not looking forward to that conversation.